Picture a quiet village in southern Romania, where everyone knows everyone, where traditions stretch back centuries, and where the boundary between the living and the dead sometimes grows dangerously thin. What happened there in 2004 will help you understand why some beliefs refuse to die, why fear can unite a community, and how ancient practices collide with the modern world in ways that still make headlines today. Let me tell you about the night that changed everything for one family, and eventually became a story that traveled across the globe. It began 6 weeks after a funeral. Petre Toma had been buried in the village cemetery of Marotinu de Sus, a small settlement tucked away in the Romanian countryside where life moves at the pace of farming seasons and Sunday church bells. His death was not unusual for a man of his age, and his burial followed the customary Orthodox traditions his family had observed for generations. The priest said the prayers, the mourners threw handfuls of earth onto the casket, and everyone went home believing that Petre Toma was at rest. But something went wrong. The first sign came in dreams. Toma's relatives began reporting nighttime visits from something that looked like their deceased family member. These were not the gentle dreams of remembrance that grieving families sometimes experience. The visitors described a presence in their bedrooms, a weight pressing down on their chests that made breathing difficult, and the unmistakable feeling of being held down by invisible hands. Night after night, the experiences repeated. Different family members, different homes, but the same terrifying sensation. In rural Romania, these signs have a name and a long history. The family knew immediately what they were dealing with. Petre Toma had become a Strigoi. Now, before we go further, let me explain what that word means, because it carries weight that the English word vampire simply cannot capture. A Strigoi is not a Hollywood monster with fangs and a cape. It is something far more personal and far more terrifying, because it wears the face of someone you loved. It returns to the places it knew in life. It targets the people who cared for it. The Strigoi is an undead being, trapped between worlds, and according to centuries of Romanian folklore, it drains the life force from the living like a parasite feeding on its host. The family faced a terrible choice. They could ignore the signs and hope the visits would stop, risking the health and possibly the lives of everyone Toma visited. Or they could take action according to the old ways, the traditions their grandparents and great-grandparents had followed when faced with the same nightmare. They chose the old ways. On a dark night in 2004, a group of villagers gathered at the cemetery. Among them were Toma's relatives and trusted community members who knew what needed to be done. They carried shovels, lanterns, and the ritual tools required for what they were about to do. The earth over Toma's grave was still relatively fresh, making the digging easier but no less grim. As they worked in the lamplight, breaking through the soil that had been blessed and prayed over just weeks before, they were performing an act that stretched back through Romanian history like an unbroken thread. When they reached the coffin and opened it, they claimed they saw the signs they expected. According to their account, the body showed little decay, the skin appeared fresh, and there were other indicators that confirmed their fears. In their tradition, a corpse that refuses to decompose properly is not resting in peace. It is active. It is feeding. What happened next is difficult for modern readers to process, but understanding it requires setting aside contemporary sensibilities and entering a worldview where the supernatural is as real as the sunrise. The villagers removed Petre Toma's heart from his body. They built a fire right there in the cemetery and burned the heart until it was reduced to ashes. Those ashes were then mixed with water. And here is the part that made global headlines. They made Toma's family members drink it. This was not cruelty. In their minds, this was salvation. The ritual of consuming the burned heart of a Strigoi is believed to break the curse, to sever the connection between the undead creature and its living victims. By taking the source of the Strigoi's power into their own bodies and transforming it through fire and water, the family believed they could finally put Petre Toma to rest and free themselves from the nightly visitations that were slowly destroying their health and sanity. For the villagers involved, the ritual worked. The nightmares stopped. The crushing weight on their chest disappeared. They could sleep peacefully again, believing they had done what was necessary to protect their loved ones. But the modern world was watching, and it did not understand. Within days, Romanian authorities arrived in Marotinu de Sus. 6 villagers were arrested for disturbing a grave, an act clearly illegal under Romanian law, regardless of the motivation behind it. The case quickly became a media sensation, not just in Romania, but internationally. News outlets from New York to Tokyo ran stories about the vampire ritual in the 21st century European Union member state. Some reports were sensationalized, others mocking, but all expressed the same underlying shock that such practices could occur in the modern era. The villagers were bewildered by the reaction. From their perspective, they had performed a necessary act of protection using methods their community had relied on for centuries. Many rural Romanians came to their defense, arguing that outsiders could not understand the depth of these traditions or the genuine belief that motivated them. The defense was not without merit. Surveys conducted in rural Romania show that over 60% of people in these communities still hold some belief in spirits, the supernatural, or the possibility of the dead returning to affect the living. This is not ignorance or backwardness. It is cultural continuity in regions where folklore is woven into daily life as tightly as religious observance. The trial that followed was brief. The arrested villagers received suspended sentences, essentially a warning not to repeat their actions. But the legal outcome was almost beside the point. The real story was what the case revealed about the persistence of ancient beliefs and the collision between traditional rural culture and modern legal systems. Think about what this means for a moment. In the same year that Romania was preparing to join the European Union, in the same country where young people were streaming to cities and connecting to global culture through the internet, a group of villagers performed a ritual that would have been perfectly normal in the 1600s. The past and present existed side by side, not as a quaint tourist attraction, but as a living, breathing reality that could still compel ordinary people to dig up a grave and burn a human heart. The story of Marotinu de Sus is not an isolated incident, though it became the most famous. Similar events have occurred throughout Romanian history and continue to occur, though most never reach the attention of authorities or journalists. What makes this case important is not its uniqueness, but its typicality. It represents visible evidence of practices that remain common in certain regions, hidden from the modern world's gaze until something forces them into the light. As we dig deeper into the legend of the Strigoi, you will see how one culture's attempt to understand death evolved into one of the world's most powerful and enduring myths. But first, we need to go back to the very beginning, before there was Romania, before there was even a word for what we now call the Strigoi. Now, let's discover how an ancient word for a bird of prey became the name for one of folklore's most terrifying creatures. You have probably seen dozens of vampire movies, read countless vampire novels, and encountered vampires in everything from serial commercials to children's cartoons. But every one of those vampires traces its ancestry back to a single word whispered in ancient tongues around fires that burned out 2,000 years ago. Understanding where that word came from will change how you see every vampire story you encounter from this moment forward. The word is Strigoi, and its origin story is as fascinating as the creature it describes. Let's start with Latin, the language of the Roman Empire. The Romans had a word, strix. The plural was striges. This word appears in ancient Roman texts, and it meant something specific. A strix was a screech owl, but not just any owl. It was a creature of evil omen, a bird associated with death and darkness, a predator that hunted in the night and was believed to feed on human blood. Owls are nocturnal hunters. They fly silently through darkness on wings designed by nature to make no sound. Their eyes are enormous, adapted to see in conditions where humans are nearly blind. To ancient peoples who lived without streetlights or flashlights, owls were genuinely frightening creatures. They were masters of a realm that humans could not control, the night itself. The Romans took this natural fear and elaborated it into mythology. In Roman folklore, the strix was not just a bird, but a shapeshifter, a creature that could appear as a bird or as an old woman, that entered homes while people slept and fed on the blood of infants and young children. The Roman poet Ovid wrote about striges, describing them as birds with large heads, staring eyes, rapacious beaks, and greyish-white wings, creatures that flew at night and attacked unguarded infants in their cradles. Here we see the foundation being laid. A nocturnal predator, a creature associated with blood, an entity that attacks the vulnerable while they sleep. These are not yet vampire characteristics as we know them, but the building blocks are already in place. Now let's add the second ingredient. Before the Romans arrived, the territory we now call Romania was inhabited by a people called the Dacians. These were fierce warriors who fought desperately to maintain their independence against Roman expansion. They had their own language, their own culture, and their own beliefs about death and the afterlife. The Dacians believed that the soul did not immediately depart when a person died. Instead, it lingered in a state of transition, neither fully alive nor fully at peace. During this time, certain souls could become trapped or corrupted, unable to complete their journey to the afterlife. What made a soul vulnerable to this fate? A person who died violently, who died before their natural time, who died with important business unfinished, or who died without proper burial rites, might find their soul stuck in the world, angry and jealous of the living. These restless souls were believed to cause harm to their former communities. They could blight crops, sicken livestock, or attack people directly, draining their vitality and life force. When Rome conquered Dacia in the early 2nd century AD and began a process of colonization and cultural mixing that lasted centuries, these two separate traditions began to merge. The Latin word strix gradually transformed through linguistic evolution into the Romanian Strigoi, but in the process, it absorbed the Dacian ideas about restless dead souls. By the Middle Ages, when we start to see written records that describe Romanian folklore in detail, the Strigoi had become a fully developed concept. It was an undead being, a corpse animated by a corrupted spirit, something that looked human but was fundamentally changed by death. Let me describe what medieval Romanians believed a Strigoi looked like. The skin was pale, drained of blood, stretched tight over bones. The body was gaunt, emaciated. The eyes might appear sunken or might glow with an unnatural light. The teeth were often described as lengthened or sharpened. The fingernails continued to grow, a natural process of decomposition that medieval people interpreted as evidence of continued life. Most disturbing of all, Strigoi was sometimes described as appearing exactly as the person had in life, completely normal until they opened their mouth to feed or revealed their true nature through their actions. This ambiguity was part of what made Strigoi so frightening. You might not know you were facing one until it was too late. Strigoi were not limited to one form. Medieval accounts described them transforming into animals, particularly those associated with darkness and death. A black dog, a bat, a cat with glowing eyes, or sometimes into stranger forms like balls of fire or shadows that moved independently. This shape-shifting ability made them even more difficult to identify and defend against. The belief also held that Strigoi could become invisible. They could enter homes unseen, stand beside the living without being detected, and watch people go about their daily lives. What did Strigoi do? They were blamed for a specific constellation of misfortunes. When someone in a family died and then other family members fell ill with wasting diseases, the Strigoi explanation made sense. The dead person was draining life from their surviving relatives. When livestock began dying mysteriously, when cows stopped producing milk, when chickens stopped laying eggs, Strigoi was suspected. For farming communities that depended on livestock for survival, these losses were catastrophic. When crops failed without obvious cause, when fields that should have been productive yielded poor harvests, Strigoi might be blamed. The presence of an undead creature corrupted the land itself, poisoning the soil and preventing normal growth. Notice a pattern here. All of these misfortunes actually happened in pre-modern rural communities with depressing regularity. Diseases did spread through families. Livestock did die from infections and parasites. Crops did fail. The Strigoi legend provided a framework for understanding these events, attributing them to an identifiable cause that could, theoretically, be dealt with through specific actions. This is crucial. These beliefs were not random superstitions. They were sophisticated explanatory systems that allowed people to make sense of their world and take action in the face of uncertainty and suffering. When something went wrong after a death in the community, the Strigoi explanation offered identification of the problem, understanding of the cause, and procedures to fix it. The legend also included specific ideas about timing. Many traditions held that the soul wandered for 40 days after death before its fate was finally determined. This 40-day period was a critical time when the deceased could still affect the living world and when the risk of a person becoming a Strigoi was highest. Families took special precautions during this period. They held memorial services, made offerings, lit candles, and performed rituals intended to help the soul complete its journey peacefully. If these actions were properly performed and the deceased had lived a good life and died a natural death, the soul would find rest. But if something went wrong, the soul might become trapped as a Strigoi. The belief system also explained why some dead returned as Strigoi, while others rested peacefully. A person who died violently was at high risk. This included death by murder, suicide, accident, or in battle. A person who died with major sins unconfessed or without receiving last rites from a priest was also vulnerable. A person whose body was not properly buried according to religious tradition almost certainly became a Strigoi. By the time we reached the late Middle Ages, the Strigoi belief was universal in rural Romania. It shaped how people thought about death, influenced funeral practices, and provided the framework for responding to certain types of misfortune. It was a living tradition, constantly reinforced by personal experience and community testimony. The legend that began with ancient Latin words for predatory birds and Dacian beliefs about restless souls had evolved into something far more complex and powerful. It had become a complete cultural system for understanding and responding to death. Next, we need to discuss what people did about it. How do you stop something that is already dead? Here is a question that probably has not kept you awake at night, but should fascinate you nonetheless. How do you fight an enemy that has already died? The Romanian tradition developed elaborate answers to this question, and understanding those answers will reveal something profound about how human cultures create systems of control over their deepest fears. The methods used against Strigoi were not symbolic or metaphorical. They were visceral, physical, and often brutal. But before we recoil in horror, we need to understand the logic behind these practices. These were carefully structured rituals with specific purposes, performed by people who believed they were protecting their communities from genuine supernatural threats. The most famous method is staking. You have seen this countless times in movies. A wooden stake driven through the vampire's heart. But the Romanian tradition was more complex than Hollywood suggests. First, the stake itself mattered. It could not be just any piece of wood. Common requirements included that the stake be made from certain types of wood, believed to have protective properties. Oak was popular because of its strength. Hawthorn was used because it was considered holy wood. Ash wood was another option, believed to have cleansing properties. The wood often had to be cut at a specific time and prepared with prayers or blessings. The stake had to be driven through the heart in one powerful blow. This requirement was crucial. A hesitant or partial staking was believed to anger the Strigoi without destroying it. The person wielding the stake needed to be strong, determined, and committed. What happened during the staking? Accounts are disturbing. People reported that the corpse would cry out, that blood would gush from the body, that the corpse would move or thrash as if alive, that gases would escape making sounds like screams or groans. We now understand these as natural results of decomposition. When a stake penetrates a decomposing body, it can release trapped gases. Decomposition creates fluids that can spray when pressure is released. But to medieval and early modern witnesses, these reactions confirmed that the Strigoi was real and was being hurt by the stake. This perceived confirmation strengthened belief in the ritual's effectiveness. Staking was not always enough on its own. Many traditions held that additional steps were necessary. Decapitation was often prescribed as a follow-up to staking or as an alternative method. The head had to be severed from the body completely. This was not a quick or easy task, requiring a sharp axe or large knife and considerable force. The reasoning was straightforward. It prevented the Strigoi from using its body by destroying the connection between the head and the body. But removing the head was only the beginning. What you did with the severed head mattered enormously. In some traditions, it had to be buried separately from the body, sometimes at a crossroads where the spirit would become confused about which direction to take. Other traditions called for the head to be buried face down beneath the body, so that if the Strigoi tried to dig its way out, it would dig deeper into the earth. Fire was another crucial element. This makes intuitive sense. Fire is the ultimate purifier, reducing organic matter to inorganic ash. Fire also has deep symbolic significance as a force that drives away evil. The heart specifically was often targeted for burning. We saw this in the Marotinu case. The heart was removed from the corpse and burned completely. The reasoning was that the heart was the seat of life force, the organ most associated with the Strigoi's power to drain vitality from others. The ashes created by burning Strigoi's heart had their own significance. They were sometimes mixed with water to create a potion that family members had to drink. This practice sounds horrifying to modern sensibilities, but within the logic of the ritual, it made perfect sense. By consuming the ashes, you demonstrated dominance over the Strigoi. You transformed it from a threat into something you had literally internalized and neutralized. In some extreme cases, the entire body was burned. This was the nuclear option, employed when other methods had failed or when the creature was believed particularly dangerous. Complete cremation left nothing behind for the spirit to inhabit. Garlic played a starring role in anti-Strigoi measures, though its use was more preventative than destructive. Garlic was believed to repel Strigoi, to cause them pain or discomfort. This belief likely originated from garlic's strong odor and its known antiseptic properties. In an age before antibiotics, garlic was used medicinally to treat infections. Garlic was used in multiple ways. Cloves were placed in the mouth of a corpse before burial. Garlic was rubbed on windows and door frames to create barriers. It was hung in bunches in homes and around the necks of children who were considered most vulnerable. Some traditions called for garlic to be buried with the corpse, surrounding the body with cloves. Salt was another protective substance, valued for its purifying qualities and its ability to preserve food from decay. If salt stopped organic matter from rotting, perhaps it might also prevent a corpse from reanimating. Salt was sprinkled around graves, mixed with holy water, placed in lines across thresholds, and sometimes put in the coffin with the body. Holy water and religious objects represented the power of Christianity. Priests were often involved in anti-Strigoi rituals, blessing graves, performing exorcisms, or consecrating objects used in the destruction process. The cross was a powerful symbol, worn as jewelry or carved into wooden stakes. Church bells rung at specific times were believed to drive away evil spirits. The involvement of religious authorities shows how Christianity and older pagan beliefs merged in Romanian culture. Local priests often participated in or sanctioned anti-Strigoi rituals because they recognized that their parishioners genuinely believed in the threat and needed spiritual support. Physical barriers were also employed. Crossroads held special significance as places where different paths intersect and spirits become confused or trapped. Running water was another barrier. Strigoi were believed unable to cross rivers or streams. Some communities took preventative measures before burial. Coins were placed over the eyes or in the mouth of the corpse. The coins served multiple purposes: payment for the soul's journey, or heavy objects that physically weighed down the eyelids. Nails were sometimes driven through the skull or through the joints of a corpse before burial. This gruesome practice had a clear logic. Nails literally pinned the body to the coffin or to the earth, preventing movement. Thorns placed inside the coffin served a similar purpose. Rose thorns or hawthorn branches were laid on top of the body, creating a painful barrier that would discourage the corpse from trying to rise. Certain items were believed to compel Strigoi to perform actions that would delay them. Poppy seeds or mustard seeds scattered around a grave were thought to force a Strigoi to count every single seed before it could leave. Since there might be thousands of seeds, this counting would occupy the creature for the entire night, and dawn would arrive before it finished. The timing of anti-Strigoi actions mattered enormously. Saturday was often specified as the proper day because it was believed that Strigoi were most active and vulnerable on this day. Specific saints' days or religious holidays also provided windows for action. The phase of the moon was sometimes considered relevant. Now let's talk about how communities decided when these extreme measures were necessary. When problems began occurring that might indicate Strigoi activity, the community would first look for patterns. Were the problems concentrated in one family? Were they occurring near a specific grave? Village elders or people with specialized knowledge might be consulted. These experts would interview the affected people, examine the evidence, and compare the situation to known cases from the past. If the evidence pointed toward a specific deceased person, the next step was often to observe the grave for signs. A grave that showed disturbances raised suspicions. Plants growing strangely around a grave was another sign. Animals avoiding a particular grave was significant. In some cases, bodies were exhumed for examination without immediately proceeding to destruction. What did they look for? A body that showed little decay was the primary sign. The skin appearing plump or rosy suggested that the body was somehow being nourished. Hair and nails that appeared to have grown confirmed suspicions. Blood around the mouth or nose was seen as evidence that the Strigoi had been feeding. Flexibility in the limbs when the body should have been stiff was another sign. Once confirmation was obtained, the community would decide on the appropriate response. This was typically not an individual decision, but involved multiple people, ensuring that responsibility was shared. The actual performance of the ritual was often a community event. Multiple people would be present, serving as witnesses, assistants, and moral support. The presence of many witnesses served several purposes. It distributed responsibility, it ensured the ritual was performed correctly, and it created shared testimony that the threat had been addressed. After the destruction ritual was completed, the site had to be properly treated. The disturbed grave would be blessed again with elaborate ceremonies. Holy water would be sprinkled, prayers recited, garlic planted, protective symbols placed. Follow-up observation was crucial. The community would watch carefully to see if the problem stopped, if the sick people began recovering, if the nightmares ceased, if livestock health improved. This was proof that the ritual had worked. But what happened if the problems continued? This was a serious situation. Perhaps the wrong body had been targeted. Perhaps the ritual had been performed incorrectly. The belief system had explanations for failure built in, which is one reason it was so robust. It is important to understand that these practices, as violent as they seem, were not performed with malice toward the deceased person. The rituals were framed as necessary acts of protection, as mercy even, because they released the trapped soul. Destroying the Strigoi was presented as helping both the dead person and the living community. The methods we have discussed represent centuries of cultural evolution. Different regions developed variations based on their own experiences. What remained consistent was the core belief that death was not always final, that certain circumstances could create undead threats, and that humans had the power to fight back. But understanding the legend requires exploring another dimension, the idea that not all Strigoi were dead. Some walked among the living, hiding in plain sight. Imagine discovering that your neighbor, someone you have known your entire life, is actually a monster. Not metaphorically, but literally, a creature that drains life from others. This is the territory of the living Strigoi, and it reveals something disturbing about how fear and folklore can turn against the living just as violently as they address the dead. Romanian folklore drew a sharp distinction between two categories. We have discussed the Strigoi morti, the dead Strigoi. But there was another category, the Strigoi seitke, the living Strigoi, humans who carried the curse while still alive and walking among their neighbors. Understanding this distinction is crucial because it shows how the legend functioned not just as an explanation for events after death, but as a way of categorizing and sometimes ostracizing certain living people. What made someone a living Strigoi? According to tradition, certain conditions at birth or in early life marked a person as cursed. These markers were not choices the person made or moral failures. They were accidents of biology timing, or family circumstances that the individual had no control over. Being born with teeth was one of the most significant markers. Most infants are born toothless, but occasionally, very rarely, a baby is born with one or more teeth already erupted. This occurs in about 1 in every 2,000 to 3,000 births. It is a harmless anatomical variation. To medieval Romanian villagers, however, a baby born with teeth was a terrifying omen. Teeth are for biting, for consuming. An infant who had teeth before it should seem fundamentally wrong. The child was marked from birth as carrying the curse of the Strigoi. Being born with a caul was another marker. A caul is a piece of the amniotic membrane that sometimes remains attached to a baby's head at birth. It happens in fewer than 1 in 80,000 births. In Romanian tradition, it was seen as evidence that the child had 1 foot in the spirit world. Birth order could also doom a child. Being the 7th child of the same gender in a family was considered dangerous. If a family had 6 sons and then another son, that 7th boy was at risk of being seen as a living Strigoi. The number 7 has mystical significance, and a 7th child disrupted the natural order. Being born on a Saturday was another risk factor in some regions. Saturday was associated with supernatural activity. A child born on this day was thought more susceptible to spiritual influences. Physical appearance could mark someone as well. Having red hair combined with blue eyes, a rare genetic combination in Romania, made a person stand out visibly. This striking appearance was sometimes interpreted as a sign of otherworldly influence. Consider what all these markers have in common. They are characteristics that the person has no control over. A living Strigoi was not created by evil actions. They were born into their curse, marked from the beginning by circumstances they did not choose and could not change. What was a living Strigoi believed to do? When livestock fell ill in a household, neighbors might recall that someone marked as a living Strigoi had visited recently. The connection would be made. The living Strigoi's presence had caused the illness. When crops failed in certain fields, people might notice those fields were adjacent to property owned by someone suspected of being a living Strigoi. When a child developed a wasting illness, the community might look for who had been around the child recently. If someone marked as a living Strigoi had held the baby, or even looked at them in the wrong way, that person could be blamed. Living Strigoi was said to have supernatural abilities. Shapeshifting was the most dramatic. At night, a living Strigoi supposedly could transform into animals: black cats, dogs, bats, or owls. Some accounts describe them transforming into balls of fire or strange lights that floated through the darkness. The transformations supposedly happened involuntarily when the living Strigoi slept. While their physical body lay in bed, their spirit would separate and roam in animal or energy form. This created the disturbing possibility that a living Strigoi might not even know what they were doing, that they might be genuinely innocent of the harm they caused. Another ability attributed to living Strigoi was the power to drain life force without physical contact. Simply being near a living Strigoi could supposedly sap your energy. Long-term exposure was believed to cause chronic wasting. This belief had obvious social consequences. People avoided those suspected of being living Strigoi, excluding them from social gatherings. Some traditions held that a living Strigoi, upon death, would inevitably become a dead Strigoi. The curse that made them a living Strigoi in life would prevent their soul from finding peace in death. This belief meant that a living Strigoi represented not just a current threat, but a future one as well. How did communities deal with living Strigoi? Unlike dead Strigoi, living Strigoi could not be destroyed with stakes and fire. They were living humans, but they could be ostracized, marginalized, and forced to live on the edges of society. Some individuals marked as living Strigoi from birth might be driven from their families or communities as they grew older. They might be forced to live alone, away from the village. They might be prohibited from certain activities, not allowed to handle food that others would eat, not permitted to attend celebrations, barred from marriage. In some cases, protective rituals might be performed on the living Strigoi themselves. Priests might conduct special blessings attempting to lift the curse or contain its effects. The person might be required to wear specific protective amulets or follow certain restrictions. Children identified as living Strigoi faced particularly difficult lives. Imagine growing up knowing that everyone feared you, that your playmates were kept away from you, that adults looked at you with suspicion and dread. The psychological damage would be immense. The living Strigoi concept reveals how folklore can create self-fulfilling prophecies. If you treat someone as a monster from birth, if you isolate them and deny them normal human connection, you create conditions where that person may indeed become hostile or antisocial. Their resulting behavior then confirms the original suspicion. This dynamic appears throughout history in various cultures. The scapegoat mechanism, where a community identifies certain individuals as sources of contamination or danger, is a universal human pattern. The living Strigoi belief gave this mechanism a specific supernatural framework. Not everyone marked as a potential living Strigoi suffered extreme persecution. In some communities, the belief existed, but was applied loosely. A child born with teeth might be noted as unusual, but still raised normally unless specific problems arose. As modernity gradually reached rural Romania, belief in living Strigoi began to decline in many areas. People started to understand that being born with teeth was a medical curiosity, not a curse. Red hair and blue eyes were recognized as genetic variation, but the decline was not uniform or complete. The living Strigoi legend shows us how supernatural beliefs function in society. They are not just explanations for external events. They also serve as mechanisms for social control, for marking boundaries between acceptable and unacceptable, for managing difference and deviance. But the belief system did not remain isolated in Romania. As we will see, these ideas about undead creatures traveled far beyond the Romanian countryside. They merged with other traditions and eventually inspired the most famous vampire in literature. Let's turn now to that transformation, to the moment when Romanian folklore met Victorian literature. Every monster has a birth certificate, even if it is literary rather than literal. The vampire, as you know, can trace its lineage back to a specific moment when an Irish writer sitting in London combined Romanian folklore with historical accounts of a brutal medieval ruler and created something that would outlive them both by generations. The year was 1897. Queen Victoria sat on the British throne. Telegraph wires carried messages across continents, but much of the world remained mysterious to Western Europeans. Into this moment, a book appeared that would reshape how the entire world thought about vampires. The book was Dracula. The author was Abraham Stoker, known as Bram Stoker, an Irish theatre manager and writer who had never visited Eastern Europe, but had an extraordinary talent for research and atmospheric writing. The key to Stoker's success was his source material. He did not invent the vampire from imagination. He researched, gathering accounts of vampire legends from multiple sources and focusing particularly on Eastern European traditions. His most important source for Romanian folklore was a Scottish writer named Emily Gerard. Emily Gerard was born in Scotland in 1849. She married an Austrian cavalry officer, and his military postings took them to Transylvania. While living there, Gerard became fascinated by local customs and folklore. She had access to Romanian communities that few Western Europeans ever saw. In 1885, Gerard published an essay titled Transylvanian Superstitions. This essay described numerous folk beliefs, including detailed accounts of the Strigoi. Gerard explained how villagers believed that dead people could rise from their graves, how certain signs indicated someone had become undead, and how specific rituals were performed to destroy these creatures. Her essay brought Romanian folklore to English-speaking readers in a way that was both accessible and authoritative. The essay was exactly what a fiction writer looking for authentic folkloric material would need. Bram Stoker read Gerard's essay. We know this because his working notes for Dracula survive and include references to Gerard's work. Stoker was already planning a vampire novel, but Gerard's essay gave him the specific details he needed to ground his story in something that felt real. The description of the Strigoi, with its emphasis on the undead leaving graves to feed on blood, provided the core characteristics of his villain. But Stoker added something crucial. He wanted his vampire to be a specific individual, a character with history and personality. For this, he turned to historical research and found Vlad III, known as Vlad Tepes, which translates to Vlad the Impaler. Vlad ruled Wallachia in the mid-1400s. He was a voivode, a title equivalent to prince or warlord, and his reign from 1456 to 1462 was marked by brutal methods. His nickname derived from his preferred method of executing enemies, impalement, a horrifically slow and painful form of execution. Historical accounts describe Vlad as exceptionally cruel even by medieval standards. He reportedly impaled thousands of people and displayed their bodies as warnings. One famous story claims he held a feast surrounded by a forest of impaled corpses. To be clear, the historical Vlad had no documented connection to vampirism or supernatural activities. He was a mortal man who used extreme violence as a political tool. In Romanian history, Vlad is actually viewed with some ambivalence. While his methods were brutal, he defended Romanian territories against foreign invasion and is sometimes celebrated as a nationalist hero. But Stoker was not writing history. He was writing Gothic horror, and he recognized that Vlad's historical cruelty, combined with his connection to the same region where Strigoi legends originated, created a powerful fictional possibility. What if this brutal medieval ruler had become one of the undead creatures his own people feared? The name Dracula itself comes from Vlad's father, who was known as Vlad Dracul. Dracul means dragon in Romanian, referring to his membership in the Order of the Dragon, a chivalric order dedicated to defending Christianity. The suffix makes Dracula mean son of the dragon or little dragon. It was an informal nickname for Vlad III. However, the Romanian word drac also means devil, and Dracul can be interpreted as the devil. This linguistic ambiguity gave the name Dracula a sinister double meaning that Stoker recognized and exploited. His vampire count was both descended from a dragon-associated warrior lineage and could be read as son of the devil. Stoker never visited Romania. He worked from travel accounts, from Gerard's essay, from maps and guidebooks, from encyclopedias and historical texts available in libraries. His research was extensive but entirely second-hand. This created an interesting effect. His Transylvania is atmospheric and evocative, but also somewhat fantastical, filtered through Victorian British imagination rather than direct observation. In Stoker's novel, Count Dracula is explicitly described as having been a warrior in life, as having fought against the Turks, as having been a member of the Dracula family. Stoker connected his vampire to Romanian history through these references, but he also wove in the folkloric elements from Gerard's account. His Dracula does what Strigoi does. He leaves his grave to feed on the living. He is repelled by garlic, holy objects, and running water, all elements from Romanian folklore. He can transform into animals, particularly a wolf or bat. He creates new vampires by feeding on victims until they die and rise again. He is destroyed by a stake through the heart and by decapitation, the exact methods used in Romanian tradition. But Stoker added elements from other vampire traditions and from his own imagination. He made his vampire aristocratic and sophisticated, giving Dracula a castle, wealth, and cultured manner. He emphasized the vampire's immortality and the psychological seduction involved in vampirism, creating a sexual subtext largely absent from Romanian folklore about dangerous corpses. He set much of the story in England, making Dracula an invasive threat from the East. The structure of the novel as an epistolary narrative, told through diary entries, letters, and newspaper clippings, gave it a documentary feel. Readers encountered the vampire through the eyes of multiple witnesses, each providing their perspective. This technique made the supernatural events feel like they were being discovered, rather than simply narrated. When Dracula was published, it was not an immediate massive success, but it found its audience and gradually built a reputation. What really cemented the novel's impact was its adaptation into other media. The 1931 Universal Pictures film, Dracula, starring Bela Lugosi, brought the character to American audiences and established many vampire conventions we now take for granted. Lugosi's performance, with his accent, his formal evening wear, his hypnotic stare, defined how English-speaking audiences imagined vampires. Through the 20th century and into the 21st, Dracula has been reimagined hundreds of times in films, novels, comics, television shows, and video games. Each adaptation adds new elements while retaining core features traceable back to Stoker's novel and through it to Romanian folklore. What is remarkable is how this process transformed Romanian folklore into global mythology. The Strigoi was a regional belief, specific to Romanian culture, and largely unknown outside it. Within 50 years of Dracula's publication, vampires in the Dracula mold had become internationally recognized, appearing in cultures that had no indigenous vampire traditions of their own. The specifics of Romanian folklore became universal vampire characteristics divorced from their original cultural context. This transformation had complex effects on Romania itself. On one hand, it brought international attention to Romanian culture. On the other hand, it often reduced Romanian culture to this single sensational element. Romania became the vampire country in Western imagination, associated primarily with Gothic horror, rather than with its complex reality. Some Romanians embrace this association and the tourism revenue it generates. Others resent it as a caricature that distorts genuine culture. The tension between these perspectives continues today. Visit Romania as a tourist, and you will find vampire-themed attractions everywhere in certain regions, especially around Bran Castle, which is marketed as Dracula's castle despite having no actual connection to either Vlad or Stoker's novel. The irony is that the literary vampire that grew from Strigoi folklore has, in some ways, overshadowed that folklore in popular consciousness. If you ask someone about vampires, they will describe something much closer to Stoker's invention than to the original Romanian beliefs. They might not even know the word Strigoi. Even in Romania, especially in urban areas and among younger generations, Stoker's vampire has influenced how people understand their own folklore. The global pop culture vampire has circled back and reshaped perceptions of traditional beliefs. But we should recognize what was preserved in the transition. Despite all the changes, certain core elements remain constant. Vampires are undead. They feed on the living. They can be destroyed by specific methods. They are both attractive and repulsive. These elements trace directly back to the Strigoi. The success of Dracula also sparked increased interest in genuine folklore. Academics began documenting vampire traditions from various cultures more systematically. The fictional creation inspired people to look more carefully at the real traditions. And this brings us to a crucial point. While Dracula conquered the world of fiction, the Strigoi continued to exist in Romanian tradition. The living folklore did not stop just because it inspired a novel. People in rural Romania continued to believe and continued to practice the old rituals. To truly understand both, we need to look at how Strigoi beliefs manifested in daily life, where the undead were not distant monsters, but returned relatives whose presence evoked grief as much as fear. Death creates distance. The person who was present suddenly becomes absent. The chair they sat in is empty. The bed they slept in is cold. But what if that distance could be violated? What if the dead could return not just in memory but physically, walking back into the spaces they left? This is where Strigoi belief becomes most personal and most psychologically complex. Romanian folklore insisted that Strigoi did not haunt random people. They returned to family, to the homes they knew, to the places where they had lived. This specificity made Strigoi encounters intensely personal. You were not dealing with an abstract monster, but with your father, your wife, your child in corrupted form. Imagine the emotional complexity. Your husband died 3 weeks ago. You are deep in grief. One night you wake to find a figure standing beside your bed. In the darkness, it looks like your husband. It speaks with his voice. It knows things only he would know. Is this a comforting visitation or something dangerous? The folklore provided frameworks for interpreting these experiences. Some returned dead were relatively benign. They appeared as familiar figures, not obviously monstrous. They might sit quietly near the fire as they had in life. They might walk through rooms they had lived in. Some accounts describe the dead asking for simple things: food, a drink, acknowledgement. Families sometimes welcome these quiet visitations. Grief creates a desperate desire for continued connection with the deceased. If your loved one appears in a form that seems peaceful, why would you not welcome them? The line between comforting ghost and dangerous Strigoi was not always clear. The folklore suggested that the dead were lonely. They missed living. They were not yet ready to fully separate. This explanation framed the visitations sympathetically, presenting the dead as pitiable rather than only frightening. A Strigoi visiting its family home might be seeking comfort, contact, reassurance that it was still remembered. But other signs indicated more sinister intentions. If livestock began dying after these visitations, if family members fell ill, if children had nightmares, the benign interpretation had to be reconsidered. The beloved dead person might have become something that caused harm, even if it did not intend to. The timing of problems mattered enormously. If someone died, and then within days family members began experiencing the pressing sensation on their chests at night, if they woke feeling drained and exhausted, if they saw the deceased person in disturbing dreams, these rapid sequences suggested cause and effect. Think about what happens physiologically after someone dies. Family members are exhausted from caretaking, from emotional strain, from disruption of routines. Sleep is disturbed by grief. The body's stress response affects the immune system. Dreams are filled with images of the deceased. In this state, people are primed to interpret experiences through the lens of the supernatural. The sensation of pressure on the chest during sleep is particularly interesting because it maps onto sleep paralysis. This occurs when a person becomes conscious while their body remains in the paralyzed state normal during REM sleep. The experience includes inability to move, often with a sensation of pressure on the chest, difficulty breathing, and frequently visual or auditory hallucinations. People experiencing sleep paralysis often see figures in the room or feel a presence. Without knowledge of the neurological explanation, these experiences feel absolutely real and terrifying. In Romanian tradition, the pressing wait was a classic sign of Strigoi visitation. When multiple family members reported similar experiences, the social confirmation strengthened belief. If your wife says the dead uncle visited her, and then your daughter reports the same experience, and then you yourself have a terrifying night where you wake unable to move with crushing weight on your chest, the pattern seems undeniable. Offerings to the dead were one way families tried to manage visitations. Bread, milk, salt, wine, or other foods would be left out, particularly at thresholds. The logic was propitiation. If you gave the dead what they wanted, perhaps they would be satisfied and leave peacefully. These offerings had deep roots in ancestor veneration practices. Many cultures maintain some form of feeding the dead, recognizing death anniversaries with food offerings or maintaining graves. In Romanian tradition, these practices took on added urgency when the dead seemed to be actively returning. The idea that Strigoi could only enter a home if invited is one of the most famous elements of vampire lore. This rule created a clear boundary. The home was safe unless someone inside granted permission. Once invited, however, the vampire could come and go freely. The origin of this belief relates to concepts of threshold magic and the home as sacred space. The doorway was a boundary between inside and outside, between domestic safety and wild danger. The requirement that evil spirits needed invitation gave families a sense of control. But this rule also created psychological tension. What if a Strigoi appeared looking exactly like your loved one? What if it asked to come in with the voice of your dead mother? Would you refuse? Could you refuse? The emotional manipulation potential was enormous. The overlap between grief and fear in these beliefs is profound. Grief makes you want the dead person back. Fear tells you that wanting them back is dangerous. The tension between these impulses created intense psychological conflict for grieving families. Consider a widow whose husband has just died. She desperately wants to see him again. When something that looks like him appears, when his voice calls to her, what should she do? Accept the visitation and risk becoming a victim. Refuse and face the pain of rejecting what might be genuine final contact. This emotional complexity made Strigoi belief far more sophisticated than a simple monster story. It engaged with the real psychological experiences of grief, longing, fear, and ambivalence that death creates. It acknowledged that love for the dead does not simply end at death, that the bonds between people can feel so strong that mortality seems insufficient to break them. The rituals around death and mourning can be understood partly as mechanisms for managing this emotional danger. The funeral established that the person was truly dead. The vigils served multiple functions: showing respect, supporting the grieving family, and beginning the process of psychological separation. The careful observance of memorial services at specific intervals after death marked time passing and helped the living adjust to permanent absence. Services at 40 days, 6 months, 1 year created a structure for grief while also serving as checkpoints. The community involvement in these practices was crucial. Grief isolated people, but death rituals brought the community together. When everyone participated in mourning, the burden was shared. The stories of the dead returning home reveal the deep human truth at the heart of Strigoi belief. Death is not just a biological event, but a social and psychological rupture that communities must manage collectively. The beliefs about how the dead might return, what signs indicated danger, and what actions were necessary gave people tools for navigating the difficult period after loss. In modern psychology, we understand prolonged grief disorder, where acute pain persists far beyond normal mourning. We recognize that grief can manifest physically as exhaustion, illness, disrupted sleep. Romanian folklore did not have this clinical language, but it had the Strigoi concept, which served similar functions. It externalized the danger of remaining too attached to the dead, making it a visible threat that could be addressed. The question the folklore forces us to ask is this: how do we balance maintaining connection with the dead through memory and love with the need to accept their absence and move forward? The Strigoi legend provided one culture's answer to this universal human challenge. But understanding how families dealt with private encounters requires understanding the communal practices that were mobilized to prevent or respond to these threats. Darkness has always belonged to fear. Before electricity, night meant vulnerability. You could not see threats approaching. The natural human response was to stay awake, to watch, to maintain vigilance. Romanian tradition transformed this practical concern into ritual, creating structured practices where communities collectively face the night and the dangers it might bring. The prevegi, the vigil held for the dead, was one of the most important practices. When someone died, their body remained in the home or church, and family, along with neighbors, maintained constant watch beside it. This vigil continued from death until burial, sometimes for several days. The purposes were multiple. On the practical level, it ensured that someone was always with the body, guarding against disturbance and verifying that the person was truly dead. Stories of people being buried alive haunted communities, and the vigil provided time for certainty. But the vigil had spiritual and social dimensions beyond this. Sitting with the dead was an act of respect, a final service. It demonstrated that the person had been valued. The constant presence meant the deceased was never alone in their transition. The vigil was also protective, creating a human barrier between the body and any malevolent forces. The presence of living people, their prayers and conversation, supposedly deterred evil spirits or prevented the newly dead from rising prematurely. The atmosphere was complex, mixing solemnity with social interaction. This was not silent mourning, but a communal gathering where people talked, told stories about the deceased, shared food and drink, and supported each other. The practical needs of staying awake meant that coffee or stronger spirits circulated. Stories were crucial. People told tales of the deceased's life, but also told ghost stories, tales of previous deaths and mysterious events, accounts of Strigoi encounters. These narratives kept people alert and reinforced cultural knowledge about supernatural dangers. The vigil also created an opportunity for ritual protection to be layered onto the body and the space. Prayers were recited regularly. Holy water might be sprinkled. Garlic, candles, and other protective objects were arranged strategically. The watchers often wore protective amulets. As dawn approached and the vigil finally ended, there was collective relief. The dangerous night had passed. The dead had been properly attended, and now the body could be committed to the earth with hope that it would rest peacefully. But the privigi was not the only form of night watching. On certain nights considered especially dangerous, the entire community might mobilize. The Noaptea Strigoi, the night of the Strigoi, was one such occasion. The specific timing varied by region, but typically fell on certain saints' days or at transitional points in the calendar. On these nights, people did not simply lock their doors and hope for safety. They actively prepared their defenses. Homes were protected with garlic around doors and windows, crosses displayed prominently, holy water sprinkled at thresholds. Livestock were brought into fortified barns. Children were kept inside under close watch. Young men often formed patrol groups that walked through the village during these dangerous nights. Armed with whatever they could carry, torches providing light, these patrols represented the community's active defense. The sound of these patrols moving through the darkness, voices calling out, light of torches visible from windows, provided reassurance to families sheltering inside. They were not alone. The community was awake and watching. Dogs played a crucial role. Romanian folklore held that dogs could sense supernatural entities before humans could. A dog barking in the middle of the night, especially if multiple dogs began barking together, was taken as a warning. Roosters crowing was another important sign. Roosters naturally crow before dawn, but if a rooster crowed at an unusual hour, it was interpreted as a reaction to supernatural presence. The belief held that Strigoi were forced to return to their graves at the first crow of the rooster. The importance of dawn cannot be overstated. Darkness was the realm of the Strigoi, but daylight forced them back underground. Every sunrise was a victory, proof that the community had survived another night. This daily cycle of vulnerability and safety structured village life. Night meant danger and required precaution. Day meant relative security. The distinction shaped everything from work schedules to social interactions. The communal nature of these practices is what made them effective as cultural rituals. No one faced the night alone. Whether sitting vigil, patrolling the village, or sheltering at home, people knew that others were doing the same, that the entire community was engaged in collective defense. It also distributed the psychological burden. Fear is more manageable when shared. The beliefs were validated by universal participation, and the rituals provided concrete actions that transformed passive fear into active response. The night watches also served as occasions for transmitting cultural knowledge between generations. Young people learned by participating, by listening to stories, by joining patrols, by observing how elders performed rituals. As we have seen, the night watches were far more than superstitious paranoia. They were sophisticated social rituals that served multiple functions: honoring the dead, supporting grieving families, maintaining community cohesion, transmitting cultural knowledge, and managing the very real psychological challenges of death and darkness. But vigils and patrols were defensive measures. When specific threats were identified, more focused protective measures came into play. If you have ever wondered why vampires in fiction are repelled by garlic, why crosses hold them at bay, the answer lies in centuries of Romanian folk practice refined through observation. These were not random superstitions, but carefully developed defensive strategies based on what people believed worked. Let's start with garlic, because it has become the most iconic anti-vampire symbol. Garlic is a member of the allium family, producing a pungent odor from sulfur compounds. This strong smell has been recognized throughout human history. Romanian tradition valued garlic for reasons beyond its smell. First, garlic had genuine medicinal properties. It has natural antibiotic and antiseptic qualities. In an age before modern medicine, crushed garlic applied to wounds could help prevent infection. These observable health benefits created an association between garlic and vitality, between garlic and life itself. If garlic promoted life and health, the logic extended to suggest it would be anathema to creatures of death and disease. Strigoi represented corruption and decay. Garlic represented the opposite, purification and health. The strong smell itself was thought to be repellent to spirits. Many cultures believe that evil entities are driven away by strong, pure scents. Garlic was deployed in multiple ways. The most direct method was wearing it. Cloves were strung into necklaces that people wore around their necks, especially children, who were considered most vulnerable. The garlic hung close to vital organs, creating a protective barrier. Doors and windows were rubbed with crushed garlic or had cloves hung nearby. These entry points were critical boundaries where protection needed to be strongest. Barns and animal shelters received the same treatment. Farmers rubbed garlic on the horns of cattle, hung it in chicken coops, scattered cloves around pastures. In burial practices, garlic played a preventative role. Cloves were placed in the mouth of a corpse before burial. Some traditions called for garlic to be sewn into the burial shroud or scattered throughout the coffin. When a grave was suspected of housing a strigoi, garlic was one of the tools used. Before resorting to exhumation, communities might try planting garlic around the grave. If exhumation occurred, garlic might be placed in the disturbed grave afterward. The seasonal availability of garlic shaped when it was most commonly used. Garlic is harvested in summer and can be stored for months, meaning it is available year-round. This practical availability made it an ideal protective substance. Everyone could afford protection. Crosses and other Christian symbols represented a different kind of power. Where garlic drew on natural properties, crosses invoked the authority of Christianity. The cross symbolized Christ's sacrifice and victory over death, making it potent against the undead. Iron crosses were especially valued because they combined religious symbolism with the protective properties attributed to iron itself. People wore small iron crosses as jewelry, hung larger ones in their homes, and carried them when traveling at night. Wooden crosses carved from specific trees had their own significance. Oak, ash, or hawthorn crosses drew on both Christian meaning and the properties attributed to these woods. The crosses had to be properly blessed by a priest to be fully effective. When confronting suspected strigoi activity directly, people would hold crosses before them like shields. The belief was that the strigoi would be unable to approach the sacred symbol or would be weakened by its presence. Holy water was another weapon. Water blessed by a priest during religious ceremonies was collected and kept in homes. It could be sprinkled around property to create sacred boundaries, used to bless family members or livestock, or thrown directly at suspected threats. The logic came from Christian theology, but also from older associations between water and purification. Water cleanses, washes away contamination. Holy water supposedly elevated this natural property to the spiritual level. Salt served a similar purifying function. Salt has been valued throughout history as a preservative, preventing food from rotting. This practical use gave salt symbolic associations with preservation and resistance to corruption. Salt was scattered around graves in lines or circles. It was mixed with holy water. Lines of salt across doorways marked boundaries that evil could not pass. The white color also associated it with purity. Poppy seeds and mustard seeds represented a different strategy based on the belief that strigoi were compulsive counters. These tiny seeds by the thousands could be scattered around a grave or along paths. The creature would be compelled to count every single seed before it could proceed. Since there were too many seeds to count before dawn, the Strigoi would be forced to return to the grave when daylight approached. Running water as a barrier appears prominently in vampire lore. Rivers and streams were believed to form boundaries that Strigoi could not cross. The living could use bridges, but the undead had to find other ways around, or were simply stopped. The logic draws on multiple sources. Water, especially moving water, was associated with purification and with life. Rivers were life-giving forces. They were also natural boundaries that divided lands. Church bells had protective power derived from their religious function and their sound itself. The ringing marked time, called people to worship, and announced important events. But bells were also rung to drive away evil spirits. The sound waves were believed to disrupt supernatural entities. During dangerous nights, churches might ring their bells at intervals throughout the darkness, providing communal protection. The sound reassured people that they were not alone. Fire itself was the ultimate purifier. Keeping fires burning throughout dangerous nights served multiple purposes: light to see by, warmth for comfort, and the symbolic presence of a purifying force. Candles specifically had religious significance when blessed by the church. Lighting candles during vigils and on dangerous nights was both practical lighting and spiritual protection. Red ribbons worn by children served as protection against curses and evil eye, as well as Strigoi. The color red has complex symbolism. It represents blood and life, but also warning and danger. Thorns and sharp objects placed around or in graves served to physically impede any creature trying to move. Even if a Strigoi was not fully solid, passing through thorns would be painful and difficult. The combination of all these protective methods created a layered defense system. A typical home during a dangerous period might have garlic at doors and windows, crosses on walls, holy water at thresholds, salt lines across entry points, candles burning, and family members wearing protective amulets. Practically, if one method failed, others might still prove effective. Psychologically, having multiple visible defenses reassured the family that they had done everything possible. The effectiveness of these methods was constantly reinforced through experience. When a family used protection and suffered no attacks, the protection was credited. When someone neglected defenses and experienced problems, the lack of protection was blamed. What we can say with certainty is that these protective practices served important psychological and social functions. They gave people agency in the face of fear. They created structured responses to anxiety. They mobilized communities in coordinated efforts that reinforce social bonds. The fact that many of these symbols persist in contemporary vampire fiction demonstrates their cultural power. When modern writers need to show characters defending against vampires, they reach for garlic, crosses, and stakes because they carry the weight of centuries of tradition. But even the best defenses were not always sufficient. Sometimes, despite all precautions, Strigoi activity persisted. When that happened, communities had to confront how beliefs adapted across centuries, especially when challenged by modernization and state authority. You might think that electricity, automobiles, and scientific education would banish supernatural beliefs. The 20th century brought dramatic changes to Romania. 2 world wars, communist dictatorship, the fall of that dictatorship, and eventual integration into the European Union transformed the country. Yet through all these changes, belief in the Strigoi persisted in surprising ways. The 2004 case in Marotinu de Sus was not an isolated incident. Similar events occurred throughout the 20th century and continue into the 21st, though most never reach media attention. These cases revealed that traditional beliefs maintain power in communities where they are embedded in social relationships and cultural identity. During World War I, soldiers from various nations fighting across Romanian territory reported encounters with local practices related to the dead. Some accounts describe coming across villages where recent graves had been disturbed, where bodies showed signs of staking or other anti-Strigoi measures. The soldiers reacted with shock. But context matters. World War I brought unprecedented death to Romanian villages. Soldiers died in battles. Civilians died from disease and starvation. Communities faced levels of mortality that strained traditional coping mechanisms. In this context, reports of increased anti-Strigoi activity make sense not as evidence of ignorance, but as evidence of communities using every tool available to manage overwhelming trauma. If modern medicine and state authority could not protect you from death, perhaps the old ways could at least protect you from the dead. The communist period, which lasted from the late 1940s until 1989, brought direct state opposition to religious and folkloric beliefs. The Romanian Communist Party promoted atheism and scientific materialism. Superstitions were officially considered remnants of the feudal past that needed to be eliminated. Yet the communist government comprehensively failed to eliminate Strigoi belief. Why? Several factors explain this failure. First, belief was embedded too deeply in rural culture to be easily extracted. It was woven into family relationships, community structures, and personal identity. To reject belief in Strigoi meant rejecting the wisdom of your grandparents, questioning your community's shared experiences. Second, the communist state did not have resources to closely monitor every village. State authority was most visible in cities. In remote rural areas, traditional practices continued largely undisturbed. People learned to be discreet, but did not stop performing rituals. Third, the hardships of communist rule ironically reinforced reliance on traditional beliefs. Economic difficulties, political repression, limited access to healthcare created conditions where people needed sources of hope and agency beyond what the state provided. Ethnographers working during the communist period documented numerous examples of continuing belief and practice. One account from the 1960s describes a burial where the body was placed face down in the coffin, an old practice intended to disorient a potential Strigoi. After the fall of communism in 1989, there was an explosion of public religiosity and cultural revival. Churches reopened, religious education became acceptable, and people felt freer to discuss beliefs that had previously been risky. Media coverage of supernatural beliefs increased dramatically. Romanian television and newspapers began reporting on village rituals, sometimes sensationalizing these stories for entertainment. The Marotinu de Sus case occurred in this post-communist context. Romania was about to join the European Union, an event that would bring the country into closer integration with Western Europe. The timing made the vampire ritual particularly embarrassing to Romanian authorities and to many Romanians trying to present their country as modern and European. Some Romanians defended the villagers, arguing that cultural traditions deserved respect. Others condemned the act as barbaric and shameful. The case became a flashpoint for larger questions about national identity, modernization, and the relationship between urban and rural cultures. Similar cases have occurred since 2004. Local Romanian media occasionally reports on villages performing old rituals after sudden deaths. These reports confirm that the practices continue. In some regions, Strigoi-related traditions have been partially commercialized and incorporated into folklore festivals. These events blend genuine tradition with performance for tourists, creating a hybrid form where old beliefs are simultaneously preserved and transformed into entertainment. This brings us to the complicated relationship between Strigoi belief and the Dracula tourism industry. Bran Castle, despite having no genuine connection to either Vlad the Impaler or Bram Stoker's novel, markets itself as Dracula's castle and attracts hundreds of thousands of tourists annually. For many Romanians, especially those who benefit economically, the Dracula connection is valuable even if historically inaccurate. For others, the commercialization of what were once serious traditions feels like mockery. Younger generations of Romanians, especially those educated in cities, typically view Strigoi beliefs with skepticism or as part of cultural history rather than current reality. They might acknowledge that their grandparents believe such things but do not personally fear Strigoi. The generational divide is stark, yet even among skeptical young urbanites, elements can persist in subtle ways. People might not believe in literal Strigoi, but still feel uncomfortable in cemeteries at night. They might not perform traditional rituals, but still respect that their rural relatives do. The internet and social media have created new spaces for discussing traditional beliefs. Romanian language forums include discussions where people share family stories about supernatural experiences, debate the reality of folkloric entities, or ask for advice. Some treat the subject seriously, others ironically. International interest in vampires through movies and television has also created a feedback loop, where global pop culture vampire images influence how Romanians think about their own folklore. Young Romanians are more likely to have encountered vampires through modern media than through direct transmission of traditional Strigoi beliefs. Some scholars worry that genuine Strigoi tradition is being lost or diluted. They document oral histories and try to preserve authentic folklore before the last generation that fully believed it passes away. Others argue that folklore is always evolving, that traditions change over time, and that what matters is understanding how they adapt. Even commercialized vampire tourism or internet discussions represent legitimate evolution. What seems clear is that complete eradication has not occurred despite a century of dramatic change. Elements persist in rural areas, in older generations, in family stories, in cultural festivals, in tourism, and in subtle behavioral patterns. Romania's experience with Strigoi belief in modern times suggests that the relationship between tradition and modernity is more complex than simple replacement. Traditional beliefs can adapt, can find new niches, and can coexist with scientific knowledge. As we approach the end of our exploration, we need to consider what all of this means, how the Strigoi legend connects to broader human experiences, and what lessons this particular tradition might offer. Every legend is a map, not a map of territory, but a map of human concerns, fears, values, and attempts to make sense of experiences that resist easy explanation. The Strigoi legend maps something fundamental about how humans deal with death, how communities maintain cohesion, and how culture provides tools for managing the boundary between the known and the unknown. At its heart, the Strigoi legend addresses death's greatest mystery and threat. Death takes people from us permanently, creating absences that feel wrong. We want the dead to come back. We dream about them, imagine conversations with them, sometimes feel their presence so strongly that the line between imagination and perception blurs. But we also fear what that return might mean. The story gives shape to the shapeless anxiety of loss. Instead of just feeling that something is wrong after someone dies, you have a name for that wrongness: Strigoi. Instead of vague unease, you have specific signs to look for. Instead of helpless confusion about why misfortunes cluster around death, you have an explanation. The legend transforms overwhelming emotion into something structured and therefore manageable. It also serves as a guide for community response. Death affects entire communities, creating disruption and anxiety that need to be addressed collectively. The rituals around Strigoi belief mobilized communities in coordinated action. These collective responses reinforced social bonds and created shared experiences that strengthened community identity. Think about what happens when a community faces a crisis together. The process of collectively responding creates connections between people. You are no longer isolated individuals, but members of a group working toward a common goal. The Strigoi legend provided numerous occasions for this kind of communal mobilization. The legend also functioned as a cultural preservation system, encoding and transmitting knowledge across generations. When elders told stories about Strigoi to children, they were teaching observation skills, ritual knowledge, and social values. This educational function operated largely unconsciously, but was effective regardless. The transformation of the Strigoi into Dracula and the subsequent global spread of vampire mythology represents one of the most successful examples of folklore adaptation in history. A belief specific to Romanian culture became a universal narrative that resonates across vastly different societies. Part of the answer lies in the universal fear of death and fascination with the possibility that death might not be final. Every culture deals with these concerns, but Romanian folklore provided especially rich elaboration. The specificity of Strigoi traditions gave the legend texture and authenticity that made it compelling raw material for fiction. Bram Stoker's genius was recognizing how Romanian folklore could be translated into Victorian Gothic terms. His Dracula represented not just the undead, but foreign invasion, sexual threat, ancient evil penetrating modern civilization. The novel worked on multiple levels, combining supernatural horror with social commentary and psychological drama. The century plus since Dracula's publication has seen the vampire become infinitely flexible as a metaphor. Vampires have represented aristocratic exploitation, sexual predation, disease, alienation, immortality and its costs, and countless other themes. Each interpretation adds layers while retaining core elements traceable to Romanian folklore. The commercial success has created a multi-million-dollar tourism industry in Romania. Cities associated with Vlad or Dracula attract visitors worldwide. Bran Castle hosts vampire-themed events and sells souvenirs. This tourism is deeply ambivalent for many Romanians. On the positive side, it brings economic benefits and puts Romania on the international map. On the negative side, the vampire association can overshadow everything else about Romanian culture. The country becomes reduced to a single stereotype. The tension between these perspectives plays out in various ways. Some Romanians enthusiastically embrace Dracula tourism. Others actively resist it, asserting the primacy of other aspects of Romanian culture. Most fall somewhere in between, pragmatically accepting that vampire tourism exists while trying to introduce visitors to broader Romanian heritage. The persistence of genuine Strigoi belief in rural areas, even as Dracula tourism flourishes in urban centers, creates an interesting layering where different forms of the tradition exist simultaneously. A village elder who genuinely believes in Strigoi occupies a different conceptual world than a tour guide giving entertaining talks about Dracula to tourists. Both are connected to the same ultimate source, but the connection has been transformed almost beyond recognition. For scholars studying folklore, the Strigoi to Dracula evolution provides a case study in how traditions travel, mutate, and generate new forms while maintaining genetic connections to their origins. The process reveals that folklore is not static, but dynamic, not isolated, but interactive with other cultural forms. it also raises important questions about cultural ownership and representation. Does Romania own the vampire legend because it originated there? Or has the vampire become global cultural property? When Hollywood makes a vampire movie bearing no resemblance to Romanian folklore, is that cultural appropriation or legitimate creative evolution? These questions have no simple answers. The Strigoi legend also offers insights into how humans create meaning from observation. Many elements arose from misinterpretation of natural processes. Bodies decompose in ways that can seem like signs of continued life. Bloating, skin discoloration, fingernail appearance changes. Without modern forensic knowledge, these changes could reasonably be interpreted as evidence that death was not quite complete. Sleep paralysis creates genuine experiences of being held down, unable to move, with crushing weight on the chest. These experiences are terrifying and feel absolutely real. Before neurological explanations were available, supernatural attack was a logical interpretation. Disease patterns where one family member dies and then others fall ill could be explained by contagion, but in an era before germ theory, the pattern could also support the interpretation that the dead person was draining life from living relatives. This does not mean people who believed in Strigoi were stupid or irrational. They were observing real phenomena and constructing explanations using the conceptual tools their culture provided. Their reasoning process was sound even if their premises were incorrect. They looked for patterns, tested hypotheses, and preserved knowledge that seemed effective. This is fundamentally scientific thinking, even when applied to supernatural frameworks. Modern science has provided alternative explanations. Microbiology explains disease transmission. Psychology explains grief responses and sleep disturbances. Forensic science explains post-mortem changes. These explanations are more accurate in describing physical mechanisms, but they do not always address the emotional and social needs that folklore addressed. This is perhaps why some elements persist even among people who intellectually accept scientific explanations. The rituals and communal practices that grew around Strigoi belief served functions beyond just dealing with undead creatures. They structured the grieving process, mobilized community support, created meaningful actions during helplessness, and maintained social cohesion. Even if the supernatural premise is rejected, these functions remain valuable. What lessons can we draw from the Strigoi legend that might be relevant beyond Romanian culture or vampire fiction? First, the power of narrative to shape experience. The stories we tell about our experiences determine how we interpret them and how we respond. The Strigoi narrative gave people a way to make sense of death that was emotionally satisfying and socially functional, even if not scientifically accurate. Understanding this helps us appreciate that all cultures have narratives that serve similar purposes. Second, the importance of community response to individual trauma. Death affects individuals but requires community-level responses. Modern Western culture has largely privatized grief, treating it as an individual psychological process. The Strigoi tradition, with its emphasis on communal vigils, shared protective measures, and collective decision-making, offers an alternative model where communities take collective responsibility for helping members through loss. Third, the value of ritual for managing anxiety and uncertainty. Human beings need to do something when facing threats. Rituals provide structured actions that create a sense of agency even when the situation is largely beyond control. Whether those rituals are Romanian protective measures or modern medical protocols or psychological coping strategies, they serve the function of transforming passive suffering into active response. Fourth, the resilience of traditional beliefs in the face of modernization. The persistence of Strigoi-related practices, despite a century of dramatic social change, demonstrates that folklore does not simply evaporate when confronted with scientific education. Traditional beliefs adapt, find new niches, coexist with modern knowledge in complex ways. This resilience suggests that folklore meets needs that modernity does not fully address. Fifth, the global power of well-crafted stories. The transformation of regional folklore into global mythology through Dracula shows how stories can transcend their origins and speak to universal human concerns. The vampire has become one of the most recognizable figures in world culture, constantly reinvented, yet maintaining core characteristics. The Strigoi legend connects the living and the dead in Romanian tradition, but it also connects past and present, rural and urban, local and global, folklore and popular culture, belief and skepticism. It sits at the intersection of multiple dualities, refusing to be simply categorized or dismissed. This complexity is what makes it enduring and fascinating. For Romanian communities that maintain traditional beliefs, the Strigoi remains a practical concern requiring practical responses. The legend is not historical artifact, but living knowledge that shapes how death is understood and managed. For scholars and cultural preservationists, the Strigoi tradition is valuable data about how humans create explanatory systems, how folklore functions in society, and how beliefs persist or transform across generations. For the global audience consuming vampire fiction, the Strigoi's descendants provide entertainment, metaphorical frameworks for exploring contemporary anxieties, and a safe way to engage with fears about death, loss, and the boundary between life and death. For Romania as a nation, the Strigoi and its famous descendant Dracula represent both cultural pride and cultural burden. Pride in having contributed a major element to world mythology, in possessing rich folkloric traditions with deep historical roots. Burden in being reduced to that single element in international perception, in having complex culture simplified to a sensational stereotype. The curse that became a legend is ultimately a story about stories, about how humans use narrative to make sense of experiences that resist easy explanation. It shows that folklore is not primitive science waiting to be replaced, but a different way of organizing experience that serves functions beyond accurate description of physical mechanisms. It demonstrates that culture evolves by building on existing foundations rather than replacing them wholesale. The restless souls that Romanian tradition believed could not find peace after death have found a different kind of immortality through the stories told about them. The Strigoi that once haunted Romanian villages now haunts global imagination, appearing in new forms with each generation, but never fully dying. This is perhaps the ultimate irony. Beliefs meant to keep the dead from returning have instead ensured that these particular dead, at least in narrative form, will continue returning forever. As you encounter vampire stories in whatever form, from literary classics to Hollywood blockbusters to television series to video games, you now carry knowledge of where those stories came from. You understand the cultural soil from which they grew, the human concerns they addressed, the traditions they transformed and sometimes obscured. The next time you see garlic used against a vampire, you will know you are witnessing the echo of Romanian farmers protecting their families. When you see a stake driven through a vampire's heart, you will recognize a ritual that people performed in reality, believing it necessary for their community's survival. The Strigoi legend teaches us that the boundary between life and death is not just a biological fact, but a cultural construction, something that different societies understand and manage in different ways. It shows us that our ancestors were not less intelligent than us, but working with different conceptual tools to address the same fundamental human challenges we still face. In the end, perhaps the most important lesson is this: respect the stories people tell, even when you do not share their beliefs. Those stories are maps of experiences, values, and ways of understanding the world that matter deeply to the communities that create and maintain them. The Strigoi may not exist as physical entities, but they exist as cultural forces that have shaped millions of lives across centuries. That existence is real enough to deserve our attention, our curiosity, and our respect. The legend endures not just as fiction, but as part of Romania's living folklore, as a contribution to global culture, and as a window into how humans create meaning from the universal experiences of death, loss, and the eternal question of what, if anything, lies beyond the grave.